Greetings. My name is Matthew Watson, and I'm from the McKinney Central Church of Christ here in McKinney, Texas. Today I want to talk to you about an issue that I think is often overlooked, and that's the issue of the Bible as a whole. Many people want to take certain sections of scriptures and apply them to certain situations, whether it be to win an argument or to prove a point, but they don't understand the full message of the Bible. Many people are afraid to go to the Old Testament because they don't understand what the Old Testament has to do with the New Testament. There are many difficult things to understand about the Old Testament. And so I want to talk about these things today. I want to give a very cursory overview of the Old Testament and how it fits in with the New Testament, and get an overview of the whole plan of God, or the message of God. And to break these sections down into 3 different sections of the Bible. I think it can be broken down easily by the patriarchal period that lasted about 2,500 years, give or take. The Mosaic period for 1,500 years. This lasted around 1,500 years, give or take. And then the Christian period, which lasts about 2,000 years, and even today. And we'll prove that point later on in this talk. The patriarchal period had no written law during that time. God talked to certain patriarchs, fathers of certain families, and gave commandments to those families. This is how he communicated with the people, with mankind. And this is the period of Adam and Eve, during Adam and Eve. When Adam and Eve first sinned and they were in the Garden of Eden, they ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And God had to cast them out of his presence. They were in perfect union with God during that time of the Garden of Eden. But because they sinned, because they were tempted by Satan, who was in the form of a serpent, they caused separation from God. And God, being who he is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. It talks about it in 1 John. And so he had to cast man out of his presence. And we see that about 1,600 years later, Noah came onto the scene. And we see that God was upset with the people of the world. They were very wicked in his eyes. And so to punish them, he was going to flood the whole earth. But he found one righteous man, and that man was Noah. And Noah built an ark just as God commanded, and for some 100 years he preached to the wicked people of the world, trying to change their minds and trying to have them follow God and to live righteously. But yet he was only able to save 8 people: Noah and his wife, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. And we see 500 years later, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob come onto the scene. And God promises Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that he would give them a nation, which was fulfilled through Israel. That he would give them a land, which was fulfilled in Canaan, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then he would give them a seed, and which through them all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And through that lineage, it would be Christ. Christ would come and save the world. And we'll talk about that in further videos later on. And so we see that Jacob's name is eventually changed to Israel. And there was a famine in the land, and they moved their family to Egypt to support themselves. And because they were so fruitful, and because they grew so mightily in the land of Goshen, the Egyptians forced them to slavery. And the people of Israel cried out to God. They asked God to save them. And God did save them through a deliverer, Moses. Moses came onto the scene and delivered the nation of Israel out of the hands of the Egyptians. And most of us remember the story of crossing the Red Sea, where the nation of Israel crossed over dry land into the wilderness and wandered the wilderness And eventually they came to Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb. And this ends the patriarchal period, and that's mainly the book of Genesis. And we see through Exodus and through Malachi, the Mosaic period begin. And this began when God gave the nation of Israel a covenant through the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. In Deuteronomy 4, starting in verse 10, it talks about this. How on the day that you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, the Lord said to me, gather the people to me, that I may let them hear my words, so that they may learn to fear me all the days that they live on the earth, and that they may teach their children so. And you came near and stood at the foot of the mountain, while the mountain burned with fire to the heart of heaven, wrapped in darkness, cloud, and gloom. Then the Lord spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but saw no form. There was only a voice. And he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform. That is, the 10 Commandments. He wrote them on 2 tablets of stone. Now this is important, because this is a written law, the first written law that God has given to the nation of Israel. And oftentimes throughout the Bible it refers to the covenant with the nation of Israel. And this is talking about the 10 Commandments. And we see throughout the Mosaic time period that there are prophecies of a new covenant that was to come. And we'll look at that in just a little bit. But after they come from Mount Sinai, they eventually get to the promised land. And that was the land of Canaan. Remember, this land was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob during that patriarchal age, which we said lasted about 2,500 years. And we're under the Mosaic time period because they had given a written law. God had given them a written law to follow. And we see in the land of Canaan that they were ruled by judges, about 15 judges during that time. And most of these judges were military leaders who would rescue the people of Israel from their oppressors. And these were different nations, foreign nations, that would come and persecute the nation of Israel. And God heard Israel's cry when they were suffering, and God sent judges. And this lasted for about 350 years. And we see later on that in the beginning of 1 Samuel, that the people of Israel begin to want to be like every other nation. They look around at all the other nations and they say, we're not like every other nation. They have kings that fight their battles. We want to have a king that fights our battles. And so we see in 1 Samuel 8 that Samuel, one of the prophets during that time, anoints a king for Israel. And that first king is Saul. And we see David come along to the scene. And we see Solomon come onto the scene. And Solomon dies around 925 BC. And this causes the nation of Israel to split. Now we could go into detail about these stories because there's many details that we could go into. But we're giving a cursory overview of the whole Bible. Remember. So we see that 925 BC Solomon dies. And the nation of Israel splits. We have the northern nation of Israel and the southern nation of Judah. The northern nation of Israel is very wicked. They never have a righteous king. And they last till about 721 BC. And eventually the Assyrians capture the Israelites. And we see that Judah has a few righteous kings, but yet most of them are wicked and they eventually fall. And they fall to the Babylonians at around 606 BC. We see during this time that there are many prophets God sends. Because of their constant lack of following God's word and going back to doing what they wanted to do, following foreign gods, God would send a prophet to warn them that there was going to be trouble that would come, that they would be punished. And eventually that happened through the capturing of the Israelites by the Assyrians and the capturing of Judah by the Babylonians. So during this time, we see during the Mosaic Age, there's many transitions. We see the judges, we see kings during the United Kingdom, and we see the divide of the kingdom. And we see the northern and southern lands being captured by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And during this time, the prophets prophesy of a new covenant, of a better covenant that would eventually come. In Jeremiah 31, starting in verse 31, we see that covenant that's being prophesied about, that there will be a New Testament that would come. Remember, we're talking about the Old Testament up until this time. In Jeremiah 31, starting in verse 31, it says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, declares the Lord, I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more." So Jeremiah speaks of hope, that there's going to be a better covenant that would come, that would be written on their hearts, not on 2 tables of stone, as we saw the first covenant being written on, but that there would be a law for all men, not just the nation of Israel. And this begins the Christian period. And we see in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Synoptic Gospels, talk about the life of Christ. And this is the beginning, when Christ dies on the cross, the beginning of a new covenant that God makes with not just the nation, physical nation of Israel, but to all who are willing to follow him and to obey his commandments. We see that fulfillment of Jeremiah, as we talked about in Hebrews 8, starting in verse 6. Hebrews 8, starting in verse 6. "But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. For he finds fault with them when he says, Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, and so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law into their minds and write them on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful toward their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more." Now look at this. Verse 13. "And speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away." There are many people who refer back to the Old Testament when they talk about, well, this is why I practice such things. And they go back to the Old Testament. But we have to remember that when Christ dies, he makes the first covenant obsolete. We don't offer animal sacrifices anymore. We don't have a physical temple anymore. But yet we have a new covenant that Christ enacted when he died. He ratified that new covenant through his blood. And it talks about this in Hebrews 10. Hebrews 10, starting in verse 9 and 10. "Then he added, Behold, I have come to do your will. He does away with the first in order to establish the second. And by that will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all." You see, the new covenant allowed for true forgiveness of sin. Through Christ's blood, we are able to have that forgiveness of sin. We are able to come out of sin and be free from sin. That's what makes this covenant better. That's what makes this New Testament better. And that is the covenant. That is the testament that we should be following. Does that mean that the Old Testament is useless? No, it doesn't. There are many useful things of the Old Testament, and it fits in perfectly with the New Testament. But we are to follow the New Testament. We are under the new law that applies to all men when Christ died for our sins. I hope this video has been helpful to you. I hope that we have looked at the overall view of the Bible and you truly understand how it all fits together. We saw the patriarchal age that lasted about 2,500 years. There was no written law during that time, and that was during the time of Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then we talked about the Mosaic law that lasted about 1,500 years. And we see that that written law was the 10 Commandments that we often refer to, and so many people know so much about. And then finally, there is a new period, the Christian period, which we live under now. That Christ, when He died, He enacted a new covenant. And we are to live under that new covenant. Hopefully this talk has been helpful to you. Hopefully you can see how everything unfolds and fits together as a whole. If you have any questions, we invite you to contact us by email through McKinney Central Church of Christ at gmail.com. You can also go to our website at McKinneyChurchofChrist.com and talk to us. We'd love to talk to you. We'd love to get to know you. And we'd love to answer any questions you may have. We hope that you have a wonderful day, and God bless.